The world often changes quietly behind closed doors, inside briefing rooms, across encrypted calls between capitals. But sometimes history announces itself loudly, through the echo of protests in distant streets, through warnings issued across continents, and through the unmistakable tension that forms when power feels threatened. This is one of those moments. As the weekend unfolded, the White House was not watching a single crisis, but several, converging at once. In Washington, President Donald Trump was weighing options that could redraw geopolitical lines in the Middle East. In Tehran, streets filled with defiant voices despite an intensifying crackdown. And in America's heartland, a domestic operation carried out under the banner of security ignited unrest, suspicion, and tragedy. These stories may seem separate. They are not. They are connected by a single theme: how governments respond when authority is challenged. Let us begin in Iran. For more than a week, Iran's cities had been gripped by demonstrations that cut across class, age, and geography. What began as localized unrest evolved into a nationwide challenge to the country's ruling theocracy. Crowds gathered despite curfews. Chants pierced the night air. Videos circulated faster than censors could contain them. According to internationally monitored human rights organizations, the response from Iranian authorities was swift and deadly. Verified reports from watchdog groups based outside Iran indicated that hundreds of protesters had been killed as security forces escalated their crackdown. While the exact numbers remain contested, the message from Tehran was unmistakable: dissent would not be tolerated. Inside the White House Situation Room, these developments did not go unnoticed. President Trump, who had long positioned himself as an opponent of Iran's leadership, publicly warned that the killing of protesters could trigger consequences. Behind the scenes, according to U.S. officials familiar with the discussions, a range of preliminary options was laid out. Some involved military pressure, others focused on diplomatic and economic levers designed to isolate Tehran further without crossing the threshold of open conflict. No final decision was made. But the mere existence of these discussions sent shockwaves through the region. Iran responded in kind, issuing warnings of its own. Officials in Tehran signaled that any attack would not be limited to Iranian soil. U.S. and Israeli military installations across the region, they said, could be viewed as legitimate targets if hostilities began. It was a familiar pattern of escalation, but one loaded with new urgency. As analysts noted, the standoff revealed a dangerous equilibrium: a superpower calculating restraint, and a regional power signaling retaliation, both aware that miscalculation could spiral rapidly. Yet while global attention fixed on the Middle East, another crisis was quietly intensifying at home. In Minnesota, a massive federal immigration operation unfolded, described by officials as the largest of its kind in the state's history. More than 2,000 agents and officers were deployed under the authority of the Department of Homeland Security. The operation was framed not only as immigration enforcement, but as a campaign against fraud. At the center of this narrative was a years-old scandal involving misuse of pandemic-era food aid programs, an investigation initiated under the previous administration and resulting in multiple convictions. The facts of that case were real. But as conservative commentators resurrected the scandal, a broader implication began to take shape: that immigrant communities themselves were under suspicion. As this framing gained traction, federal authorities moved decisively. Agents surged into the Twin Cities. Tensions rose almost immediately. Community leaders warned that the operation risked inflaming fear and mistrust. Local officials questioned the scale and messaging of the deployment. And then, amid that charged atmosphere, something happened that would transform the operation into a national flashpoint. An ICE officer fatally shot Renee Nicole Good,
37-year-old mother.
Details emerged rapidly, but agreement did not. Federal authorities maintained that the agent acted in self-defense. Local leaders, citing video footage and eyewitness accounts, insisted the woman posed no immediate threat. Multiple videos, some recorded by bystanders, one reportedly from the officer's own device, circulated widely, fueling debate and outrage. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey publicly called for transparency and independent investigation. He did not claim to know the outcome, he said, but he emphasized something deeper: a profound erosion of trust between federal agencies and the communities they were operating in. That mistrust Frey argued, was not theoretical. It was rooted in conflicting narratives, shifting justifications, and rhetoric that escalated faster than facts. The controversy deepened when senior federal figures described the incident using language typically reserved for national security threats. The suggestion that the victim's actions could be interpreted as terrorism sparked fierce backlash. Civil liberties advocates warned that such framing blurred legal definitions and risked normalizing excessive force. As protests spread, the streets of Minneapolis became a microcosm of a broader American debate about enforcement versus accountability, about safety versus civil rights, about who defines threat and who bears the consequences. And still, the global picture loomed. From Tehran to Minnesota, the same questions echoed. How far will power go to preserve itself? When does enforcement become escalation? And who decides where legitimacy ends? By Sunday night, demonstrators in Iran continued to gather despite mounting casualties. In Washington, deliberations continued behind closed doors. And in Minnesota, calls for investigation grew louder as the nation grappled with yet another fatal encounter involving federal authority. These were not isolated events. They were pressure points testing the limits of governance in an era defined by unrest, polarization, and instant visibility. And as the next phase unfolds, the consequences of these decisions, foreign and domestic, are only beginning to surface. Power rarely reveals itself in moments of calm. It reveals itself under pressure when leaders are forced to choose between restraint and force, between optics and consequences. As protests in Iran continued to spread and the death toll mounted, the crisis entered a more dangerous phase. What was once viewed as internal unrest was now being discussed in the language of international response. Inside Tehran, the government's message hardened. State media emphasized stability. Officials framed the demonstrations as foreign-instigated chaos rather than domestic dissent. The narrative was deliberate. Protests were no longer expressions of public anger, but security threats to be neutralized. That framing gave justification to an aggressive response, and it signaled to the world that compromise was not on the table. Human rights organizations outside Iran continued compiling accounts from inside the country. They described a pattern of force that escalated day by day: live ammunition, mass arrests, internet shutdowns, and silence imposed through fear. While Iranian authorities disputed these reports, the volume and consistency of the information made it impossible for global leaders to ignore. In Washington, the administration faced a familiar dilemma, one shaped by history. Direct military intervention had defined past U.S.-Iran confrontations, often with unintended consequences. Yet inaction carried its own risks. President Trump's public statements suggested moral red lines. Killing protesters, he implied, could not go unanswered. Behind the scenes, however, officials understood the stakes were far higher than rhetoric. According to U.S. officials briefed on the discussions, the options presented to the president spanned a wide spectrum. At one end were kinetic actions, limited strikes designed to signal deterrence rather than trigger full-scale war. At the other were non-military measures, intensified sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and coordinated pressure through allies. What made the moment uniquely volatile was timing. The protests were ongoing. Any U.S. action could alter their trajectory, either emboldening demonstrators or providing Tehran with justification to crush them under the banner of national defense. Analysts warned that an external strike might unify internal factions against a common enemy, erasing the very pressure Washington hoped to amplify. Iran, for its part, understood this dynamic well. Officials warned publicly that retaliation would not be symbolic. Statements emphasized regional reach, reminding Washington that U.S. and allied military bases dot the Middle East. The implication was clear: escalation would not be contained. It would ripple outward across borders, airspace, and alliances. This mutual awareness created a tense equilibrium. Both sides signaled readiness. Both sides hesitated. Meanwhile, regional actors watched closely. Israel, long locked in a shadow conflict with Iran, monitored developments with heightened alert. Gulf states quietly prepared for instability, knowing that even limited conflict could disrupt shipping lanes and energy markets. Diplomats across Europe urged de-escalation, fearing a repeat of crises that had already destabilized the region for years. Yet the protests themselves remained the catalyst. For demonstrators inside Iran, the presence or absence of international response carried symbolic weight. Silence could be interpreted as abandonment. Action could be interpreted as hope or as danger. The uncertainty hung over the streets as heavily as the threat of force. As one analyst noted in international coverage, this was not simply about Iran, it was about precedent. How major powers respond to internal crackdowns sends signals far beyond national borders. Other governments, facing unrest of their own, watch carefully. That reality brings us back to the United States, where unrest was not theoretical, but unfolding in real time. In Minnesota, the federal immigration operation continued to reverberate through communities. Protests emerged not only over immigration enforcement, but over the broader issue of accountability. The fatal shooting of Renee Nicole Good became a focal point, a symbol of how quickly enforcement actions could turn deadly when mistrust already existed. Local leaders repeated their call for independent investigation. They emphasized transparency not as an accusation, but as a necessity. Federal agencies, they argued, could not be both the actor and the sole judge of their own conduct without undermining public confidence. The federal response remained firm. Officials defended the deployment and its objectives. They reiterated that agents were targeting fraud and criminal activity, not communities. And they stood by the officers' account of self-defense, even as video evidence continued to circulate and raise questions. This parallel crisis underscored a deeper truth: power, whether exercised abroad or at home, faces increasing scrutiny in the digital age. Every action is recorded, every narrative is contested. Authority no longer controls the story by default. In both Iran and Minnesota, competing versions of reality were colliding. Governments emphasized security, protesters emphasized rights, observers emphasized accountability. And somewhere between these narratives, the truth struggled to emerge, fragmented, politicized, and deeply consequential. As the weekend came to a close, no resolutions were reached. Iran's protests continued, their outcome uncertain. The White House maintained its posture of consideration without commitment. Minnesota remained tense, its communities demanding answers that had yet to arrive. What connected these moments was not ideology, geography, or culture, but the universal challenge of governance under pressure. When authority is questioned, the response defines legitimacy. And as the world learned again, decisions made in crisis rarely stay contained. While Washington weighed its options thousands of miles away, a different kind of confrontation was unfolding much closer to home. One without missiles, sanctions, or foreign borders, yet equally charged with political consequence. In Minnesota, the federal government's largest ever immigration operation had collided with a community already shaped by years of mistrust, unresolved trauma, and political polarization. What followed was not merely a protest, it was a rupture. The operation itself was framed in absolute terms. Federal officials described it as a necessary enforcement surge, an effort to dismantle fraud networks, uphold immigration law, and restore order. The language was firm, procedural, almost clinical. Thousands of agents were deployed, checkpoints multiplied, neighborhoods felt watched. The message from Washington was unmistakable. The federal government was asserting authority. But on the ground, the experience felt very different. In Minneapolis and surrounding areas, immigrant communities interpreted the sudden influx of federal agents not as law enforcement, but as occupation. Families stayed indoors. Businesses closed early. Rumors moved faster than facts. For many residents, the operation reawakened memories of past raids, moments when due process blurred and fear became routine. The situation escalated rapidly. Protests formed near federal buildings, hotels, and staging areas. Demonstrators carried signs demanding accountability, transparency, and restraint. Chants echoed through streets already tense from years of national debate over policing, immigration, and federal power. The demonstrations were largely peaceful, but emotions ran high, and the margin for error was thin. That margin disappeared with a single gunshot. The fatal shooting of Renee Nicole Good did not occur in isolation. It occurred within a volatile environment, one shaped by heavy enforcement, conflicting narratives, and mutual suspicion. Almost immediately, the incident became a lightning rod. Was it self-defense, as federal officials stated, or was it an unnecessary use of lethal force, as local leaders and activists argued? The video footage intensified the debate. Captured from multiple angles, including body-worn and civilian devices, the images circulated within hours. Each frame was dissected online, slowed down, analyzed, argued over. To some viewers, the footage confirmed the officer's account. To others, it raised troubling questions. What mattered most was not consensus, but division. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey stepped into that divide cautiously. He did not assign blame. He did not declare conclusions. Instead, he emphasized process. Frey called for state-level involvement in the investigation, arguing that federal agencies investigating their own actions risked eroding public trust, especially in a city with a history of strained police-community relations. His list of revs reflected a broader reality. Minnesota had become a focal point in the national conversation about federal authority and local autonomy. The state's political leadership found itself navigating pressure from both directions: federal insistence on operational control and public demand for independent oversight. Meanwhile, the rhetoric from Washington hardened.
Senior officials defended the operation not only as legal, but as necessary. They connected immigration enforcement to broader narratives of security and fraud. Years-old scandals were resurrected in public discourse, reframed as justification for aggressive action. In conservative media, the message was amplified. Enforcement was overdue, resistance was suspect.
One claim proved particularly incendiary: the suggestion that Renee Nicole Good's actions could constitute domestic terrorism ignited backlash. Legal experts questioned the interpretation. Civil rights advocates condemned the framing as dangerous and inflammatory. For many in Minnesota, the statement crossed a line, transforming a disputed incident into a moral judgment before any investigation concluded. This is where trust fractured further. To communities already wary of federal power, the language confirmed their fears. It suggested that enforcement was not merely about law, but about narrative control, about defining who is dangerous, who is legitimate, and who deserves protection. The protests grew louder. Demonstrators gathered despite cold weather, police warnings, and fatigue. They carried not just signs, but stories of families separated, of neighbors detained, of fear normalized. Some confrontations turned physical. Objects were thrown. Officers were injured. Police declared unlawful assemblies. Each escalation fed the next. Yet even amid tension, a crucial detail emerged. Local authorities repeatedly emphasized that the majority of protesters remained peaceful. This distinction mattered. It challenged attempts to portray the demonstrations as violent unrest rather than civic dissent. It underscored a core question: when does protest become threat, and who decides? Across the country, other cities watched Minnesota closely. Protests spread to Austin, Seattle, New York, and Los Angeles. Not identical in cause, but connected in theme. Immigration enforcement, federal overreach, and accountability became shared rallying points. What began as a localized operation now resonated nationally. This convergence mirrored patterns seen elsewhere in the world. From Tehran to Minneapolis, governments faced populations willing to challenge authority publicly. The contexts were different, the stakes varied, but the underlying tension was familiar. How much force is justified in the name of order, and who bears the cost when that force is misjudged? Political analysts noted the irony. While Washington debated intervention abroad in response to state violence against protesters, it simultaneously defended aggressive enforcement at home. The juxtaposition did not go unnoticed, either domestically or internationally. Critics argued that moral authority weakens when standards appear inconsistent. Supporters rejected that comparison outright. They argued that immigration enforcement is lawful, regulated, and necessary, that equating it with authoritarian crackdowns abroad is false and dangerous, that federal agents operate under rules of engagement designed to protect both officers and civilians. Both narratives gained traction. This is the defining characteristic of the moment: parallel realities competing for legitimacy. Facts exist, but interpretation dominates. Authority asserts itself, but acceptance is no longer guaranteed. As investigations continued, one truth became unavoidable. The Minnesota operation was no longer just about immigration or fraud. It had become a referendum on trust between citizens and the federal government, between local leadership and national power, between law enforcement and the communities they police. And trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. As the final echoes of protest chants faded into Minnesota's winter air, and as Washington continued its closed-door deliberations over Iran, a deeper pattern emerged, one that extended beyond any single raid, any single shooting, or any single threat of military action. These events, unfolding across vastly different geographies, were bound by a shared logic of power, legitimacy, and consequence in the modern political era. It was about how authority asserts itself in an age where every action is documented, dissected, and debated in real time, where credibility is as valuable as capability, and where the line between national security and political theater has grown increasingly thin. In Washington, the calculus surrounding Iran reflected the same dilemma now visible at home: how to project strength without triggering instability, how to punish without igniting escalation, how to lead without losing moral ground. The options presented to the president, ranging from targeted strikes to non-military pressure, were shaped not only by intelligence briefings, but by optics. Every move would be watched by allies, rivals, and domestic audiences alike. Iran understood this dynamic well. By warning that U.S. and Israeli bases could become legitimate targets, Tehran was not simply issuing a military threat, it was testing resolve. The statement was calibrated, measured, and strategic. It signaled readiness without committing to action. In the language of deterrence, it was a reminder that power invites response. Yet Iran also faced its own limits. The protests that triggered international outrage had already weakened the regime's internal legitimacy. A heavy-handed crackdown, widely reported by human rights organizations, created vulnerabilities that external pressure could exploit. Tehran's leadership now walked a narrow path, appearing defiant enough to deter foreign intervention, yet cautious enough to avoid unifying external enemies. This balancing act mirrored challenges faced by the United States. At home, the Minnesota raids and their aftermath exposed the fragility of public consent. Federal authority, though legally grounded, encountered resistance not because of its existence, but because of how it was exercised. The fatal shooting, the contested narratives, and the rhetoric that followed all contributed to a widening gap between enforcement and acceptance. Political power, history reminds us, is not sustained by force alone. It depends on legitimacy, on the belief that authority is fair, restrained, and accountable. When that belief erodes, compliance becomes conditional, protest becomes persistent, and every incident carries amplified risk. Experts in governance often point to this phenomenon as the trust threshold. Once crossed, institutions must work harder to restore credibility than they ever did to maintain it. Investigations become symbolic, statements are scrutinized, silence is interpreted as indifference, while action is interpreted as manipulation. This is where the Minnesota case took on national significance. It was no longer simply a matter for local courts or internal reviews. It became a test of whether the federal government could demonstrate transparency in a politically charged environment, whether it could allow independent scrutiny without appearing weak, whether it could acknowledge public concern without conceding operational authority. The outcome remains uncertain, but what is clear is that the response will shape precedent. Future enforcement actions, future protests, and future political debates will all reference this moment, either as a cautionary tale or as a justification. Internationally, observers are already drawing parallels. Allies watch closely how the United States handles dissent at home while condemning repression abroad. Rivals highlight inconsistencies to undermine credibility. Neutral states weigh alignment decisions based on perceived stability and fairness. In a world defined by information warfare, perception travels faster than policy. This convergence of domestic and foreign policy is not accidental. In the modern era, internal cohesion directly affects external influence. A nation divided in trust projects uncertainty abroad. A government questioned at home finds its moral authority challenged overseas. This is not ideology, it is strategic reality. For the Trump administration, the stakes are high. Decisions made now about Iran, about immigration enforcement, about accountability will define more than a political term. They will define how power is exercised in an increasingly transparent world where video footage can outweigh official statements, where local incidents can reverberate globally, where leadership is judged not only by strength, but by restraint. The administration's supporters argue that decisive action is overdue. They point to years of unchecked enforcement gaps, foreign defiance, and bureaucratic hesitation. To them, the raids and the firm stance toward Iran represent a necessary correction, a reassertion of authority in a world that respects clarity. Critics see a different picture. They warn that aggressive posture without consensus risks deepening division, that conflating enforcement with moral judgment alienates communities, that threatening force abroad while struggling with legitimacy at home creates strategic vulnerability. Both perspectives coexist, locked in a political standoff that mirrors the larger global order. What emerges from this moment will not be determined by a single investigation, a single strike, or a single protest. It will be determined by patterns, by whether leaders learn, adapt, and respond to the complexities of power in the 21st century. History offers a sobering lesson. Nations rarely collapse from external threats alone. They weaken when internal trust fractures, when institutions lose credibility, and when force replaces persuasion as the primary tool of governance. Conversely, nations endure when authority is balanced with accountability and when strength is paired with legitimacy. As winter settles over Minnesota and uncertainty hangs over the Middle East, one truth stands out.
That can be eliminated. As we're going to tell the world är som vi har en bara av touches that fits och alla som ladies låst de macros där vi.
The world is watching. Not just what decisions are made, but how they are justified, how they are implemented, and how dissent is treated in their wake. Because in an era defined by visibility, the real battleground is not always where troops deploy or agents raid. It is where trust is either reinforced or lost. And once lost, it is far harder to reclaim than any territory. This concludes the documentary Investigate. The Road Trader Skate.